That monstrous truck, it's been there for hours. A disgrace to the neighborhood. Karen's voice, sharp as a freshly sharpened blade, cut through the morning air. Her eyes, narrowed slits, watched the imposing dark blue pickup. She clutched her phone, a victorious smirk twisting her lips. The hum grew louder, a mechanical beast arriving to fulfill her righteous decree. But as the towering tow truck backed into position, a figure emerged from the quiet house, calm, unhurried. One look at him, then back at the truck's subtle insignia, and Karen's triumphant sneer began to crumble, replaced by a chilling, dawning horror. She'd unleashed a storm, but she had no idea whose thunder she was about to face. The morning sun, still low and hazy, cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of Primrose Lane. A symphony of sprinklers whirred softly, a domestic prelude to the day. Yet, a dissonant note had already been struck. Karen Albright, resplendent in her freshly pressed yoga pants and an immaculately white polo shirt, stood at the edge of her perfectly edged driveway, her gaze fixed with laser-like intensity on the dark blue Ford F-250 parked directly across the street. It was an impressive vehicle, no doubt. Gleaming from a recent wash, its chrome accents caught the early light. But to Karen, it was an egregious affront, a grotesque carbuncle on the pristine face of their cul-de-sac. It had arrived late last night, after the new neighbor, Mr. David. Miller had finally moved into the notoriously tricky corner house, the one with the awkward driveway access. Miller had parked the truck directly on the street, precisely 6 inches from the neatly painted curb. 6 inches, Karen muttered, her lips barely moving. 6 inches was not the problem. The presence of the truck was the problem. It was too big, too dark, too unofficial. It didn't belong on Primrose Lane, with its tasteful sedans and family SUVs. She'd given him the benefit of the doubt for a few hours. But by 8 a.m., her patience, a finite and highly regulated resource, had evaporated. Karen was the unofficial, self-appointed guardian of Primrose Lane's aesthetic and adherence to HOA bylaws, a role she performed with the zealous devotion of a medieval knight defending a sacred relic. Every misplaced trash can, every unapproved shrub, every blade of grass daring to grow beyond its designated height fell under her vigilant scrutiny. And this truck? This was a declaration of war. She marched back into her house, her movements brisk and purposeful. Her finger hovered over the speed dial for code enforcement, non-emergency, but a more immediate, more satisfying solution presented itself. She typed 24/7 towing services, Willow Creek, into her tablet. A quick call. Yes, I need a vehicle. Towed, she stated, her voice tight with suppressed indignation. It's a large dark blue pickup truck, parked illegally on Primrose Lane. Yes, the street. It's blocking access for emergency vehicles. A lie, but a necessary one, she rationalized. It could block access if a fire truck had to make a 3-point turn. The address is 1422 Primrose Lane, directly across from me at 1421. I am the property owner, Karen Albright. I authorize the tow. She paused, listening to the dispatcher's questions. No, I have not spoken to the owner. It's an urgent matter. Just get it gone. Back outside, she paced. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. She checked her watch. 10 minutes, 15. Good. She wanted him to see it, the new neighbor, Miller. She wanted him to understand the consequences of disrespecting Primrose Lane's unwritten laws. She imagined his face, a mixture of confusion and humiliation, as his behemoth of a truck was hoisted onto the back of a flatbed. It would be a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. A low rumble vibrated through the ground. It grew steadily into the distinctive roar of a large diesel engine. Karen's eyes gleamed. This was it. A massive, bright yellow tow truck, emblazoned. With Eagle Eye Towing and Recovery turned the corner onto Primrose Lane, its air brakes hissing as it slowed. It was glorious. The tow truck driver, a burly man with a weathered face and a baseball cap pulled low, eyed the dark blue F-250. He pulled up just behind it, then began the careful maneuver of backing up, aligning his rig. Karen watched, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Just then, the front door of 1422 Primrose Lane opened. David Miller, the new neighbor, stepped out. He was a man in his late 40s, perhaps early 50s, with a lean, athletic build and an aura of quiet competence. He wore a simple, well-fitting polo shirt and khakis, but there was something about his posture, his calm, assessing gaze, that hinted at a deeper reserve of authority. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He simply looked. His eyes drifted from the tow truck to Karen, then back to his own vehicle. He walked slowly down his driveway, approaching the scene. Karen straightened, puffing out her chest slightly. "Morning, Mr. Miller," she called, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Having a bit of trouble?" Miller stopped a few feet from the rear of his truck, his hands clasped casually in front of him. "Morning, Miss Albright," he replied, his voice a calm baritone. "Looks like it. Is there something I can help you with?" The tow truck driver, having finished backing up, emerged from his cab. He walked to the rear of the F-250, preparing to lower the ramps. He caught Miller's eye and offered a hesitant, apologetic shrug. "Got a call about an illegally parked vehicle, sir. Just doing my job." Karen, unable to contain her satisfaction, stepped forward. "Yes, he is. That truck is an obstruction, Mr. Miller. Clearly violates HOA parking regulations. We have rules for a reason, you know." Miller's gaze sharpened, not at Karen, but at the tow truck driver. "You got a permit for this, son?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. The driver, mid-stoop to unlatch the chains, paused. Well, the lady authorized it, said it was blocking. Traffic." He gestured vaguely at Karen. Karen beamed. "As a resident, I have every right to ensure the safety and compliance of our neighborhood." Miller ignored Karen, his eyes still on the driver. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a laminated card, its edges softened by years of handling. He held it up, not dramatically, but with an understated certainty. The tow truck driver's eyes widened, then quickly darted to the side of the dark blue Ford F-250. There, almost imperceptible beneath a light layer of dust, was a small, polished metal plate reflecting the morning sun. It wasn't just a heavy-duty truck. It was a department vehicle. And the card Miller held was a badge, a distinct 5-pointed star. The driver's face went pale. He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking from the badge to the truck, to Miller's calm, unreadable face, and then, with dawning horror, to Karen. "Ma'am," the tow truck driver stammered, his voice suddenly very small. I think there's been a misunderstanding here." He backed away from the truck, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. This vehicle isn't just a truck." Karen, still basking in her perceived victory, scoffed. "Of course it's just a truck. A very large, very illegally parked truck." Miller's eyes, which had been calm, now held a glint of something cold and utterly serious. He looked at Karen. "Ms. Albright," he said, his voice dropping an octave, each word precise, "this is not just a truck. And you have just authorized the towing of official county property." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like an axe. "That vehicle," he continued, gesturing to the F-250, "is an unmarked patrol vehicle assigned to the county sheriff." Karen's triumphant smile dissolved. Her jaw went slack. The blood drained from her face, leaving her complexion a ghastly shade of white. Her eyes darted wildly, first to the truck, then to Miller, then to the tow truck driver who was now frantically trying to put his chains away. The air seemed to solidify around her. She had not only picked a fight, but she had picked it with the law itself, and the law, it seemed, had just moved in across the street. The silence that followed Sheriff David Miller's pronouncement was not the peaceful quiet of Primrose Lane. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from Karen Albright's rapidly congealing dread and the tow truck driver's desperate scramble for a quick, invisible exit. The burly man, whose confidence had been fueled by a simple dispatch order, was now a trembling mess, fumbling with his chains as if they were live wires. He yanked the lever to raise his flatbed, the hydraulic hiss a stark counterpoint to Karen's internal scream. Karen stood frozen, her perfect posture crumbling into a slight involuntary crouch. The morning sun, which had moments ago felt like a spotlight on her moment of triumph, now seemed to expose her, naked and vulnerable. Sheriff. The word echoed in her mind, amplifying with each beat of her suddenly racing heart. Not just a neighbor, not just any law enforcement, but the sheriff. The highest elected law enforcement official in the county. The man whose badge held the authority to impact entire lives, including, she now realized with sickening clarity, hers. She tried to speak, but her throat had seized. A pathetic croak escaped. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted to the subtle insignia on the truck, the faint outline of a shield, the almost invisible government plate. How had she missed it? Her certainty, usually an impenetrable shield, had betrayed her. Miller, still calm, though an almost imperceptible tightness around his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, perhaps amusement, perhaps quiet exasperation, watched her. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. His stillness was more unnerving than any outburst. "Sir." "Sheriff," the tow truck driver stammered, finally managing to retract his equipment. He scrambled back into his cab, his movements clumsy. I'm so incredibly sorry. This was a mistake. We'll be on our way." He started the engine, a roar that seemed to mock Karen's internal silence. "Hold on, son." Miller's voice, still quiet, cut through the diesel rumble. The driver froze, his hand hovering over the gear shift. "Before you go, I need you to confirm who authorized this tow. For my records." The driver glanced nervously at Karen, then back at Miller, his face a roadmap of internal conflict. He knew the procedure. A false report to impound a county vehicle was a serious matter. But Karen was standing right there, her eyes practically begging him to lie. "Well, sir, the call came in from, an anonymous tip," he mumbled, avoiding eye. "Contact!" Karen let out a small, desperate gasp. The betrayal stung, even though she knew he was trying to save his own skin. Miller's left eyebrow arched, a barely perceptible movement that somehow conveyed absolute disbelief. "Anonymous, you say?" His voice took on a new, quiet edge. "Funny. My dispatcher usually logs names. And the voice on the phone, Karen Albright, was quite distinct, wouldn't you agree?" The tow truck driver's shoulders slumped. He knew he was caught. He knew Miller wasn't asking, he was stating. "Yes, Sheriff," he mumbled, defeated. "Ms. Albright authorized the tow." Miller nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement. He then turned his full attention back to Karen. Her breath hitched. The air, already heavy, seemed to crackle with unspoken consequences. "Ms. Albright," Miller began, his gaze unwavering. "You made a sworn statement to Eagle Eye Towing that my vehicle was blocking emergency access. Is that correct?" Karen's mind raced, desperate for an escape route. I thought it was," she blurted, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "It's a very large truck. It's not the kind of vehicle we typically see parked on the street here. It looked out of place, and I was concerned for the neighborhood." She gestured wildly, trying to regain some semblance of her usual authoritative demeanor. "Our HOA bylaws are very strict about street parking, you know. We have a pristine community to maintain." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "So your concern for the neighborhood led you to falsely report a vehicle obstructing emergency services." His voice remained low, but it vibrated with an undeniable authority that sliced through Karen's frantic justifications. Do you understand the implications of such a report, Miss Albright? It ties up resources. It could have diverted a legitimate emergency response, and in this case it was a deliberate attempt to interfere with county property. Interfere? Karen's voice rose, a flicker of her usual indignation trying to break through the fear. I was simply trying to enforce the rules. You're new here, Sheriff. Perhaps you're not aware of how things work on Primrose Lane. We pride ourselves on order and adherence to regulations. A slow, wry smile touched Miller's lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm quite aware of how things work, Miss Albright. I've been aware for quite some time. He took a single, deliberate step closer to her, his presence suddenly looming. And as the county sheriff, I am also aware of the legal repercussions for filing a false report and attempting to impound a government vehicle. Karen's face crumpled. Legal repercussions? Her voice was barely a whisper. But I didn't know. It was an honest mistake. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Ms. Albright, Miller stated, his tone firm. Especially when that ignorance is coupled with an intentional misrepresentation of facts. He paused, letting his words sink in. The tow truck driver here, he nodded towards the still-waiting driver, could have faced charges for attempting to tow an official vehicle without proper authorization based on your false report. His livelihood could have been seriously impacted, and my department just wasted resources on a frivolous call. The tow truck driver, sensing a lifeline, quickly chimed in. She's right, Sheriff. I had no idea it was a department vehicle. I just got the call and came out. Miller held up a hand, silencing him. I'm aware, son. That's why we're having this conversation now, before any further action is taken. He looked at Karen. However, your actions warrant a more formal response. Karen's breathing became shallow. She was trapped. All her usual bluster and self-righteousness had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She had envisioned Mr. Miller, the new neighbor, red-faced and apologetic. She had not envisioned Sheriff Miller, calm and calculating, laying out the potential legal implications of her actions. What does that mean? She stammered, her voice thin. Miller reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, official-looking notepad and a pen. It means, Ms. Albright, that I will be filing an incident report detailing your false report and attempt to tow county property. This report will be logged with my department and, given the nature of the false claim regarding emergency access, potentially with the district attorney's office. Karen's eyes widened, filling with tears of self-pity and genuine fear. The district attorney? For a parking dispute? It ceased being a parking dispute the moment you fabricated a story about emergency obstruction, Ms. Albright, Miller corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. And the fact that you attempted to have a county vehicle impounded without verifying its ownership or purpose only compounds the issue. This isn't about parking. This is about misuse of public services and interference with official duties. He paused, his gaze unblinking. Do you understand the gravity of that? Karen could only nod, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Her perfectly coiffed hair, her crisp white shirt. It all felt like a costume for a life that was now rapidly spiraling out of her control. Furthermore, Miller continued, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the street, I will be having a word with the HOA board regarding their enforcement practices. While I understand the desire for a well-maintained community, authorizing the towing of vehicles without proper verification or communication and based on false pretenses sets a dangerous precedent. It also reflects poorly on the entire neighborhood. He glanced pointedly at Karen's immaculate driveway. Perhaps a review of their procedures is in order. The implication was clear. Her reign as Primrose Lane's self-appointed warden was about to come under official scrutiny. Not only was she facing personal legal issues, but her carefully constructed social standing within the HOA was about to collapse. The tow truck driver, seeing his opportunity, cleared his throat. "Sheriff, if there's nothing else, I should probably get back to the yard." Miller nodded. "You're free to go, son. And next time, confirm the ownership of the vehicle and the validity of the claims before you hook up. Call dispatch, verify." "With the police department. Just a thought." "Yes, sir." The driver practically saluted, then quickly climbed into his truck. With a final, lingering, pitying glance at Karen, he put the truck in gear and slowly drove away, leaving behind a faint smell of diesel and the crushing weight of reality. Karen was left alone with Sheriff Miller, the full morning sun beating down on her, exposing every detail of her humiliation. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion and the sight of the large tow truck, were starting to peek from behind their curtains or casually water their lawns at a distance. She could feel their eyes, their silent judgment. "Now, Ms. Albright," Miller said, his notepad and pen ready, "let's get your full statement, and I suggest you stick to the unvarnished truth this time." He looked at his truck, then back at her. "And as for the parking, rest assured, I will ensure my vehicle is always parked legally, but I expect the same respect for official property as I would for any citizens." He waited, pen poised. Karen stood there, trembling, her carefully constructed world shattered around her. The silence. The gentle hum of Primrose Lane's sprinklers, usually a comforting backdrop, now seemed to mock Karen, each spray a whispered judgment. The silence between her and Sheriff Miller stretched, taut and agonizing. Her mind, usually a precise instrument for planning social maneuvers and community dictates, was a chaotic storm of panic and mortification. The humiliation was a physical ache, burning under her skin as she became acutely aware of the twitching curtains and the slow, deliberate movements of gardening tools across the street. Everyone knew. "Ms. Albright," Miller prompted, his voice calm, but with an underlying firmness that left no room for evasion. He still held his notepad, his pen poised. "Your statement." Karen swallowed, her throat dry. I already told you," she stammered, clinging to the only defense she had left. "It was a mistake, an honest mistake. I truly believed the truck was blocking the street." Miller's gaze was unblinking. "You stated to the tow company dispatcher that it was blocking access for emergency vehicles. That's a very specific claim, Ms. Albright. Did you verify that? With the fire department or emergency services?" "No, I assumed," she whispered, voice barely audible. "It's so big, and our street is narrow." The excuses sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Her well-practiced confidence had vanished, replaced by a raw vulnerability she despised. Assumption, especially when it leads to filing a false report, and attempting to interfere with law enforcement operations, has consequences, Miller stated, meticulously writing something on his pad. "Your cooperation now will be taken into account. Any further attempts to mislead will only exacerbate the situation." He continued to ask pointed questions about the precise time of her call, the exact words she used, and her intentions. Karen, stripped of her bluster, answered in clipped, desperate tones, each admission a further nail in the coffin of her composure. She could feel the weight of his badge, even unseen, pressing down on her. When Miller finally snapped his notepad shut and returned it to his pocket, it felt less like a relief and more like the end of an interrogation. He stepped back, observing her with a quiet intensity. "Consider this a formal warning, Ms. Albright. This incident report will be filed. Depending on the district attorney's review, further action, including legal charges, remains a possibility." Karen whimpered. "Please, Sheriff, there must be something I can do. I'll apologize. I'll pay for the tow truck's wasted time." Miller's expression remained unyielding. "The tow company has been informed of the situation. Their dispatcher will be contacted regarding their protocol for verifying claims. As for your apology, that's between you and your conscience, Ms. Albright." My concern is upholding the law." He then gestured towards his truck. "I'll be moving my vehicle to the driveway now, to avoid any further misunderstandings." He turned and walked towards his F-250, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate, as if to emphasize the unshakable authority he wielded. He opened the driver's side door, and before he got in, he paused, looking across the street at Karen. "And Ms. Albright," he added, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet street, "I look forward to discussing HOA bylaws and responsible community engagement at the next board meeting." The statement was a direct hit, a public declaration that he intended to challenge her power base. As he started the truck, the powerful engine roaring to life, Karen felt her knees buckle. She watched, horrified, as he effortlessly backed the F-250 into his spacious driveway, parking it with precision. It was now perfectly compliant, yet its presence felt more imposing than ever, a constant reminder of her blunder. She stumbled back into her house, escaping the gawking eyes of her neighbors, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Inside, the cool, air-conditioned air did little to soothe her burning cheeks. She collapsed onto her pristine white sofa, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't just the fear of legal repercussions. It was the utter mortification. Her reputation, her absolute pride in being the doyenne of Primrose Lane, was in tatters. The phone rang, shattering the fragile silence. It was Brenda Jenkins, the HOA president, her voice unusually clipped. "Karen, is it true? About the sheriff's vehicle? And you calling the tow truck?" Karen tried to compose herself, but her voice cracked. "Brenda, it was a misunderstanding. I thought it was just some delivery truck. He's new, I didn't know." A misunderstanding that involved a false report to a tow company and nearly impounding official county property, Karen. Brenda's voice was stern, devoid of her usual placating tone. "Sheriff Miller just called me. He was very clear. He intends to address the HOA board about our enforcement policies and specifically about this incident. This is a very serious matter, Karen. It reflects incredibly poorly on the entire HOA. But Brenda, I was just trying to keep our community safe and orderly. You know how important that is to me," Karen wailed, desperation creeping into her tone. "Orderly, yes, but not by fabricating emergency situations and targeting vehicles without verification," Brenda retorted. "The board is convening an emergency meeting tonight. We need to discuss this immediately, and I suggest you prepare a very comprehensive explanation, Karen. This could have serious implications for your position on the Architectural Review Committee and perhaps for the entire board." Brenda's voice was frigid. "See you at 7. She hung up before Karen could utter another word. Karen stared at the phone, a hollow ache settling in her chest. Her committee position, her influence, these were the pillars of her social standing. To lose them, it was unthinkable. Later that afternoon, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to Sheriff Miller's house. Two well-dressed figures, a man and a woman, emerged. Karen, peeking through her blinds, recognized them instantly. Richard Vance, the district attorney's chief investigator, and Assistant DA Sarah Chen. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a review. This was a full-blown investigation. The bate? Consequences were no longer abstract threats. They were pulling up in a black sedan, knocking on her new neighbor's door. She watched, paralyzed, as Sheriff Miller opened his door, a brief, calm conversation ensuing before he invited them inside. The door closed, sealing away the official business, but leaving Karen with an icy certainty. Her small, self-righteous act had ignited a firestorm, and she was very much in its direct path. The meticulous order of Primrose Lane, which she had so fiercely guarded, was about to become the backdrop for her very public undoing. The fluorescent lights of the Primrose Lane HOA clubhouse cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the faces gathered for the emergency meeting. Every chair around the long conference table was filled, and several residents stood along the back wall, a silent, expectant jury. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a nervous hum that vibrated even more intensely around Karen Albright. She sat rigidly, her usual poised demeanor replaced by a fragile stiffness, her gaze fixed on the polished tabletop. Across from her, Brenda Jenkins, the HOA president, looked grim. To Brenda's right sat Robert Sterling, the treasurer, already, flipping through financial reports with an agitated snap of pages. To her left was Eleanor Vance, the secretary, her pen clutched tightly, ready to record every syllable of the impending disaster. At the head of the table sat Sheriff David Miller. He wasn't in uniform, opting instead for a dark suit that somehow amplified his presence, making him seem both professional and utterly unyielding. He looked calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the churning anxiety in the room. Richard Vance, the district attorney's chief investigator, and Assistant DA Sarah Chen sat beside him, their expressions neutral, but their very presence a chilling testament to the gravity of the situation. Brenda cleared her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. Thank you all for attending this emergency meeting on such short notice. As you know, we're here to discuss a sensitive matter. She paused, her eyes briefly flicking to Karen. Sheriff Miller has graciously agreed to address us. All eyes turned to Miller. He rose slowly, his movements economical. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice even and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the room. I apologize for the disruption to your evening. However, as some of you are aware, there was an incident this morning involving county property and a resident of Primrose Lane. He then proceeded to recount the events concisely and factually. He described the arrival of his unmarked patrol vehicle, the call to the tow company, the false report of emergency obstruction, and the attempt to tow his truck. He didn't use accusatory language, but the sheer weight of the facts, presented with calm authority, hung heavy in the air. He cited specific statutes regarding false reporting and interference with government operations. As a result, Miller concluded, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members, an incident report has been filed with the Sheriff's Department. The District Attorney's Office is also reviewing the matter for potential criminal charges given the fabricated claim of emergency obstruction. He gestured slightly to Vance and Chen, who remained impassive. Furthermore, this incident highlights a concerning gap in HOA policy regarding resident-initiated towing. Authorizing a tow without verification, especially on a public street, places undue liability on the HOA and creates potential for significant legal issues. He sat down, leaving a deafening silence in his wake. Brenda, looking shell-shocked, finally found her voice. Karen, she said, her voice strained, would you like to respond? Karen felt a flush creep up her neck. She pushed back her chair, forcing herself to stand. Her voice trembled as she began. I am truly sorry for the misunderstanding. I want to reiterate that it was a genuine mistake. I was concerned about the size of the truck and our narrow street. I had no idea it was Sheriff Miller's vehicle or that it was county property. I was only trying to uphold the standards of our community, which I have always done with great dedication. She looked around the room, desperately seeking a sympathetic face. There were none, only stony, disbelieving stares. Robert Sterling, the treasurer, leaned forward. Ms. Albright, are you seriously suggesting you didn't know it was a government vehicle, even though it had proper plates, and you still authorized a tow based on a made-up story about blocking emergency access? His voice was laced with open contempt. Do you have any idea the liability you've put this HOA under? A lawsuit from the Sheriff's Department or the tow company could bankrupt our reserve fund? It was an oversight, Karen pleaded, her voice rising. I didn't see the plates. I just reacted based on what I thought was best for Primrose Lane. Eleanor Vance, usually quiet, spoke up, her voice surprisingly firm. "Karen, with all due respect, you've always been extremely meticulous about adherence to every single rule. You've reported neighbors for leaving recycling bins out for an hour too long. For you to claim you simply missed the official markings on a truck of that size and then immediately jump to calling a tow without even speaking to the owner, it's hard to believe." Her words, delivered without malice, but with undeniable logic, cut deeper than any anger. The residents along the back wall began to murmur. One man, Mr. Henderson, whose prize-winning rose bushes Karen had once demanded be trimmed for overgrowth, spoke up. "This isn't the first time Ms. Albright has overstepped. Remember when she tried to fine Mrs. Davison for leaving her garden? Hose out? This is just escalating." Karen's face burned. Her support system was crumbling. Even her usual allies were turning on her. Brenda sighed, running a hand through her hair. Given the severity of the situation and the potential legal and financial ramifications for the HOA, the board has discussed this extensively. While we appreciate your past contributions, Karen, your recent actions are untenable. Her gaze met Karen's, unwavering. Therefore, effective immediately, the board has voted to relieve you of your duties on the Architectural Review Committee. Furthermore, a motion will be presented at the next General Assembly meeting to remove you from the HOA board entirely. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. This was worse than she could have imagined. Her entire identity in Primrose Lane, her carefully cultivated power, was being systematically dismantled. "This is outrageous!" she finally managed to gasp, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "You can't do this! I've dedicated years to this community." Brenda looked genuinely regretful, but firm. "Karen, the board has a responsibility to protect the interests of all homeowners. Your actions have placed those interests in jeopardy." Sheriff E. Miller, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke again. "I understand this is a difficult conversation, but it highlights the need for clear communication and adherence to proper procedures within a community. My department will, of course, continue to work with the HOA to ensure safety and compliance, but within the bounds of due process and respect for all residents, regardless of their position." His implied criticism of Karen's past methods was clear. Karen glared at him, then at Brenda, then at the other board members. The room was a sea of condemning faces. She had built this community's order, enforced its rules with an iron fist, and now it was turning on her. This wasn't justice. It was a brutal, public execution. She was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of her own making, the carefully constructed facade of her perfect life shattering into irreparable pieces. As Brenda moved to formally close the meeting, Karen caught sight of her reflection in the dark, polished surface of the table. A wild, desperate look stared back, a stranger in her own perfectly ordered world. And then she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible gleam from Sheriff Miller's wrist. As he subtly adjusted his cuff, a flash of silver appeared. A thin, braided bracelet, identical to the one her own estranged son, who worked as a correctional officer in the next county over, had always worn. A sudden, chilling connection, an unexpected thread linking her public tormentor to her deepest private failure. The universe, it seemed, truly did have a wicked sense of irony. The HOA meeting concluded with a final, echoing gavel strike from Brenda. The room emptied quickly, the residents eager to escape the lingering tension, their hushed conversations a new form of buzzing judgment. Karen remained rooted to her chair, the harsh fluorescent light a spotlight on her crumbling world. The bracelet, the silver braided bracelet on Sheriff Miller's wrist, glinting like a shard of ice. It was identical to the one her son Michael had worn since his academy days, a gift from his grandmother, Michael, her only son. Their relationship had fractured years ago, a slow, painful erosion caused by Karen's relentless control. her need for everything and everyone to conform to her rigid standards. He had chosen law enforcement, a path she considered messy and unpredictable, unlike the neat, orderly world she had designed for him. He worked in the next county, a deliberate distance he'd put between them. They hadn't spoken in months. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Her nemesis, the man who had publicly dismantled her power, wore the symbol of her deepest, most painful private failure. Was it a coincidence? Or some cosmic joke designed solely for her? As she sat there, lost in the crushing weight of public humiliation and personal regret, a shadow fell over her. Sheriff Miller stood beside the table, the district attorneys, investigators having already departed. He hadn't left with the others. "Ms. Albright," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of the official tone he'd used for the board. "May I have a word?" Karen slowly lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. "What more's there to say, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice raspy. "You've made your point. You've destroyed my reputation. What more do you want?" Miller pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the empty chairs, then back at her. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's reputation, Ms. Albright. My intention was to address a serious breach of protocol and ensure it doesn't happen again, both for the safety of the community and the integrity of law enforcement." He paused. "But that's not why I stayed." Karen looked at him confused, then her gaze dropped to his wrist. He noticed. His hand instinctively went to the bracelet, his thumb gently rubbing its worn surface. "You recognize this, don't you?" Miller asked, his voice a low, almost tender murmur. Karen nodded, a single tear escaping. "My son, Michael. He has one just like it. His grandmother gave it to him." The words were a raw wound, exposed. A faint smile, tinged with a deep sadness, touched Miller's lips. "She gave me one too, on my first day at the academy." He held out his wrist, showing her the engraving on the inside. "To David, protect and serve. Love, Nana." Karen gasped. "Nana? Michael's grandmother?" The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her estranged son shared a grandmother, with Sheriff Miller. They were cousins. Distant, perhaps, but family nonetheless. Her tormentor was kin. The man she had tried to have arrested, the man who had just orchestrated her public downfall, was family. "Michael and I grew up together," Miller confirmed, his voice a quiet acknowledgement of the shared history. "He's like a brother to me. When I heard he had a new neighbor named Karen Albright moving into Primrose Lane, a neighbor he said was particular, I admit, I was curious." He looked directly into her eyes. "He mentioned the truck, too. Said he'd warned you about it, about parking it slightly off the curb to keep the driveway clear for his own visitors, and about its status as a work vehicle." Karen felt the blood drain from her face again. Michael had warned her? She hadn't listened. She had dismissed his subtle hints, his quiet attempts to explain. Her own self-importance, her relentless need to control, had blinded her. She had been so sure of her own righteousness, she hadn't bothered to truly see her new neighbor, let alone listen to her own son. "He never mentioned—" "He was sheriff," Karen whispered, a desperate plea for understanding in her voice. Miller's gaze softened. He didn't want his position to give him special treatment. He just wanted to be your neighbor, to live here quietly, like anyone else. He sighed. "But when the tow truck showed up, and the dispatcher confirmed your name, and your false report, I had to act, not just as a neighbor, but as sheriff." The full weight of her actions, amplified by this new, devastating revelation, crushed her. She hadn't just attacked a neighbor, she had attacked her family, unknowingly. She had brought down the full force of the law on someone who was essentially a relative, all because of her own hubris and refusal to see beyond her narrow world view. Karen couldn't articulate the torrent of shame, regret, and sorrow that consumed her. It wasn't about the HOA anymore or the legal threats. It was about Michael, her son, whom she had pushed away and whose quiet warnings she had ignored. She had been so obsessed with control, she had lost sight of the people who mattered most. Miller stood up, his gaze still on her, a mixture of disappointment and a faint, distant hope in his eyes. "Karen, my door is always open, not as the sheriff, but as your neighbor, and as Michael's family." He paused, his voice barely audible. "Maybe it's time to talk to Michael." He turned and walked away, leaving Karen alone in the stark, empty HOA clubhouse, the fluorescent lights humming over her. Her world had not only shattered, but its pieces had reformed into a grotesque, ironic mosaic, each shard reflecting her own failures. The legal and social consequences faded into the background. The deepest wound was the realization that her unwavering pursuit of order had led her to inflict chaos on her own life, severing the very connections she secretly craved. Karen closed, her eyes, clutching the edge of the table. The silence of the empty room was profound, broken only by her own ragged breaths. The perfect order of Primrose Lane remained untouched, but Karen Albright's rigid, controlling life had finally crumbled under the weight of its own flawed foundation. The karma was swift, precise, and utterly devastatingly personal.